Powered by Riverside FM.
Good news for people who like bad news. This is the title of a 2004 album by American rock band Modest Mouse. It's not a lyric from a song, but it is a strong title, and it points me towards the question that many people raise of why is there so much bad news? As a snapshot example, I've just looked at the headlines on the BBC News website on the 14th of December. The first 5 headlines are about the shooting on Bondi Beach, Australia. Next, there is a piece about the Home Secretary's statement that violence against women is a national emergency. Following that, there is the detention of a person of interest over the Brown University shooting in the USA. Before finally, the most positive of the headlines on the lead stories is that the train timetable revamp has taken effect with more services than promised. And finally, rounding out the top 5 stories is a policy change from the Tories about scrapping the petrol car ban if they win the next election. Overall, the first 3 stories are clearly bad news, and the second 2 are probably low significant stories that are largely neutral. Whilst today has seen a major incident, the Bondi Beach shooting, I wouldn't describe the overall positioning of news stories as atypical. Almost always, there will be negative or bad news stories leading the news, largely encompassing wars, crimes or crime prosecutions, accidents, natural disasters, scandals, abuse of power, sometimes financial or economic crashes, or perhaps sluggish growth or high inflation. There is a suite of the types of stories which tend to be negative. Now, think about the kind of stories which might be positive. Medical breakthroughs, technological innovation, peace deals, significant births, sometimes sporting triumphs. There are these types of stories. They tend to be fewer different types, and they tend to be less frequent. I think the fundamental underlying reason is about the asymmetry of these stories themselves. The most obvious one is comparing deaths and births. Deaths happen suddenly, sometimes unexpectedly in the cases of violence or accident. Births tend to happen more slowly and, by their nature, will not be of a person who is currently well known or venerated. Therefore, the bad news story is more likely to be a shock of some, is more likely to be a negative shock of some kind, and therefore news. We can extend this asymmetry more broadly and recognize that it stems from people's expectations. If your expectation is that all air traffic flights will be going smoothly, then the completion of a day of safe air travel isn't news. However, an air traffic disaster is. Likewise, in something like the size of the economy, if your expectation is always for incremental growth, then recessions or negative shocks will be news, whereas small incremental changes in growth, whilst often reported, tend not to be such a large news story. This perhaps comes into sharper relief when you think about the stock market. Large stock market crashes are huge news. Whilst thankfully rare, they do occur. However, large upward surges occur even less frequently. When they do, they're usually corrections of previous big downward surges, and it's only occasionally that significant technological breakthroughs lead to large surges on a day-to-day basis. For example, the announcement of the COVID vaccine in late 2020, or the Chinese AI surge following the announcement of DeepSeek in January 2025. And that itself was less about a overriding surge across markets and more of a rebalancing towards Chinese indices and away from US markets and the Nvidia chipmaker in particular. Sports news can sometimes be good news, particularly from a nationalistic perspective if a country has done well. But on a subnational level, it tends to be zero sum. By its nature, one team or person doing well is usually countered by another team having a terrible result. This inherent asymmetry, I think, is the root cause. However, I'm sure it's exacerbated by the way that news outlets wish to maximize readership. And sadly, we probably have an intrinsic desire to rubberneck on negative stories rather than positive ones. And this is a particular shame where, if you move aside from the day-to-day of news, slow trends globally have tended to be extremely positive. In the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling, he sets out data to illustrate the transformational scale that global development has had. Global poverty has fallen dramatically. Life expectancy has risen. This is the stat I find most compelling. Global life expectancy has increased from only 50 years in 1960 to now more than 72 years. More girls are in school than ever before. The world is safer and healthier. Death rates from war are at an all-time low. Preparation and preparedness for natural disasters has helped to mitigate the impact of those events. Vaccine programs have helped to eradicate diseases. Child mortality has dropped significantly. And in many ways, we're less violent and more resilient than we have been previously. So, overall, on a high-level global lens, there's loads of good news. It just happens incrementally and is hard to report. In the words of Modest Mouse, and this time an actual lyric, well, we'll float on, good news is on the way. So knowing that underlying positivity, how should we best approach the relentless drip of negative stories coming to us? They're obviously important too, and we do both have a right and should be informed. It is perhaps unfortunate that some stories are exacerbated so much. Today's Bondi Beach shooting is clearly a terrible incident and justifiably reported. But was it appropriate to take the first 5 slots on the news website? News organizations could take a more discerning view on what they report and how repeatedly, particularly in the world of 24-hour rolling news. We can learn something from history here. If I take us all the way back to Good Friday, April the 18th, 1930, there was a famous incident amongst BBC Radio's news. At the start of the 8:45 p.m. bulletin, the BBC announcer came on air and declared, "Good evening, today is Good Friday. There is no news," and then played piano music instead.